So welcome everyone. I'm going to just present myself a little bit. I'm Francisca Ortiz-Ruiz. I'm the founder and co-chair of the Early and Middle Career Researchers, and which is actually an organization that was created in 2021, but officially launched on 2022. I'm going to leave you the link in the chat if you want to reach us or if you want more information about this organization, but we are trying to do many things in the upcoming months. So if you are willing to be connected with us, please follow us on Twitter and follow our website. So for today's presentation, what we're going to do is that we are going to have, so today actually is our first workshop in between of three workshops that we are going to be happening, and all of them are free and online, and everyone in any part of the world can access this material. That's the whole idea behind actually these workshops. So for today, we're going to have 45 minutes of presentation. Then we're going to have a little break, and then we're going to have the second half of the presentation. So Q&A is going to be available at any point of the whole presentation. So please use the chat, or maybe we can, you can unmute yourselves. That is also available. And without further ado, I'm going to present the speakers of today's presentation. So Alejandro Espinosa-Rada is a postdoctoral researcher and a lecturer at the Social Network Lab at ETH Zurich. Before arriving in Zurich, he did his PhD in sociology at the Mitchell Center for Social Network Analysis at the University of Manchester, and his main areas of interest are small groups dynamics, sociology of social networks, sociology of science and knowledge, and science of science. Alejandro is PA of AstroNet, a project that analyzes an astronomical and astrophysics community, also co-PI of the study of social networks and socio-ecological sustainability. And he's also researching about small groups dynamics, specifically working with the Swiss student life at the Social Network Lab, ETH. Furthermore, he had created two packages that I would like to highlight, NetMen and ClassicNet. And the goal actually of the second package is to make available, compile and conserve classic data of social network history, which is something that maybe could be very interesting for people who are connecting today. He is the founder and president of the Chilean Society for Social Network Science, CHISONET, and host of the podcast Knitting Networks. Alejandro, thank you very much for being here, and I'm going to give you the floor, so any questions or anything, I'm going to be available here for any technical issues.
Okay, can you hear me well? Just checking.
Yes.
Okay, so I will share my screen, and I will do the awkward question here. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay, why not? So, okay, so first of all, thank you, Francisca, for inviting me to do this workshop. I'm very happy to, help the early career group. I think the work that you guys have done is fantastic. I think one of the things that I remember Martin Everett saying is that Linton Freeman used to say that in Sambel everyone was equal. And I think because Sambel has become bigger and bigger, this group is filling the gap of making everyone welcome, especially if you are a newcomer. So I think I have been in Oysen the last two versions in Greenwich and now in Slovenia, and I think you can see how this initiative had an impact on the community, I think. So okay. So now I will start with the title. Well, I changed the title a little bit because maybe some of you have seen the book of Linton Freeman, and Linton Freeman used to call a book as the development of social network analysis, a study in the sociology of science. And I thought that was not correct. So I take out the analysis. I don't think it's only an analysis. I think it's maybe something as a perspective. Maybe some people are claiming that it's a science. And I was a bit uncomfortable with the word of only science, because this is not only science, but also knowledge. So I was playing around a little bit with the title of the book of Linton Freeman. Anyway, so I will not talk much about me. Francisca already said nice things, so I will just skip this very quickly. Yeah, I'm in the Social Network Lab in ETH. Before I was in the Mitchell Center, and I will talk a lot about the Knitting Network podcast that I will try to promote this podcast as well. Okay, and well, there we also have people from our lab. This is the lab that I belong. This is the Social Network Lab, and the director seen there is Ulrich Brandis, which is somewhere, I think is somewhere around, and Christoph Stadtfeld. And well, we have two groups in there, the Zing group and the Algo groups. Maybe some of you have seen Bitsone. We have also Goldfish, which is another package, and we are doing really cool stuff. Sorry for the self-promotion. And here there are some example works that we were working on. Okay, so let's start with the beginning. I think to start talking about the history of networks, we have to maybe conceptualize this as a study in the sociology of science and knowledge, which means that I'm taking a position as an analyst, and as an analyst, I will tell you a story. But the story is clearly coming from me, and somehow I will try to be as fair as I can, but I may not be that fair. So just bear in mind that these things might happen, okay? So let me give you some insight of what the way I'm framing, or why I think this is a reasonable way of telling the story. So first of all, we have some scientific specialities, and scientific speciality is a concept that has a network flavor. It's coming from the studies from Nicholas Mielins and people such as Diana Crane and others. And according to this line of research, or this way of thinking about scientific networks or scientific specialities, we tend to say, okay, let's say we are in normal science. And in normal science, sometimes there are small groups, and these groups develop some new ideas. And if they are successful, they might not be successful. They become something bigger, a scientific network perhaps. And if they really achieve something, then they become a scientific specialty. This is just a very simple diagram, okay? So I will claim that, at least in the narrative that people working on this, in the narrative of people working on this area, this is the way they have thought about this specialty. They think that there are different groups, that at certain point they were all working on things that were somehow similar, and they collectively decide to become a specialty, which is very interesting from a sociological perspective, because there is a rationality process of doing it. So okay, how this work? According to the model of Nicholas Mielins, most of the time you will have something like a paradigmatic group, a couple of people thinking about new ideas, maybe something that struggled them, a puzzle that they have to resolve, and they will start communicating, and they will start, most of the time this happens in an organization, but it can happen elsewhere. And if the paradigm is become like something interesting to work on, they might start collaborating or talking with other people. So for example, I don't know, Frank Harari was in the Mitchell Center in the Manchester School at a certain point, and they start communicating. Homans was also there, and the idea starts building from different places. And again, this will involve more and more institutions. It will become bigger, and at a certain point, you will have a statement of what is this discipline or this topic or this specialty. And in here, we will base most of our conversation will be based on the book from Linton Freeman. Of course, this is his perspective, but I think it's the most complete thing that we have so far. And I will take some things from the Mielins. So there is another book from 1973 from Nicholas Mielins and Caroline Mielins, which also were trying to explain how the social network speciality came about. Okay, so that's my very quick sociological version of this. And okay, and some sociologists at least believe that if you have a small coherent group, this should be the groups that eventually will change the way disciplines or specialty came about. And of course, most of these groups requires intellectual leaders, organizations, research centers. We will train people, intellectual successes, program statements, secondary material that reflect on the previous versions, critical material, and text groups. So these are the social aspect of scientific specialties. Now, in terms of sociology of science, there's a small distinction that I would like to do here. At the beginning of the sociology of science, there was the distinction between whether we should concentrate on the social dimension or in the cognitive dimension. And I will try to mix both. I don't think that we should really split them, but maybe we should try to think in as a socio-cognitive process that evolve simultaneously. Okay. Now, let's start maybe talking about the importance of why you are here. You don't want to learn about sociology of science, maybe. But let's talk about the institutionalization of a scientific specialty. In this case, the social network. One of the questions that many of these researchers have been thinking about is whether the social network is a paradigm. And now we know, I hope, that there is a different version of what we mean by paradigm. If we go for a social dimension, maybe there was a coherent group. If we go for the cognitive side, I'm not quite sure. If we treat them both, then it is even more unclear. But at least from a historical perspective, at the Mullins, let's say, they were saying at the beginning that there were random pieces, random groups, let's say, that were navigated into a desert of the sociological knowledge. So there were groups working on networks, and they not necessarily knew each other. Some of them clearly did, but not all of them. And what is interesting is that already in the 70s, in 1977, Samuel Reinhardt was already calling a developing paradigm the social network perspective. So in a way, they were already thinking, okay, is this something that will build into a coherent program? And for example, another paper in 1988, and I think it's even 1 year before, was already calling this group a semi-visible college. So there was a social dimension of, okay, it seems that something is forming, something is happening. Maybe there is a core group of a scholar working on something. And by the 90s, so we are, I'm talking for each 10 years, Hamann and Carly were already talking about, okay, social network is in a normal science stage. And further researchers were claiming, okay, and most of these members actually share some epistemic perspective and practices. So they do things in a certain way. They confront some certain research question in different manners. And I think I will leave the question open. I don't want to answer here, but I just want to make the point that this is an open question. And even though, for example, in the book of Linton Freeman, he was mentioning, okay, if you look at the founder of social network, according to him, you will see that most of them were connected somehow by some common references. And so he was trying to build not only that the social dimension of the network was somehow coherent, but there was also a cognitive dimension that they all somehow share. Okay. Going back to the institutionalization of social networks, in 1977, Barry Wellman created INSNA. By the time there was, let's say, an experiment done by Linton and I think Sue Freeman as well, which was called the Electronic Information Exchange System. There was a bulletin of connections that arose in 1978. The journal Social Network was established in 1979. Then we have Sunbell, early handbook. So as you can see, and this is what I'm trying to show in here, is that there was already a very aggressive initiative of institutionalizing this area of research. And you can see that since 1981, Sunbell was happening in Tampa, but now we have until the 25. And well, if you are interested in meeting each other, maybe we can hang out in Scotland. I will try to go. But, yeah. So this is the next summer. It will happen in Scotland, and I think it will be great if we can see each other there. Okay. Again, in 1978, I think this is a study, very prominent researchers that I will mention them very quickly. We're already working on this area of research back in the 70s, and they are still very active. And I hope by the end of this presentation, you might recognize many of the member of this group. Okay, now let's show some current research. What I have in here. Yeah, okay. So what we have seen from bibliometric data, we have seen that the productivity and collaboration have increased over the years. Number of people with only one or solo author have decreased on time. And now papers with more than, let's say, 3-4 collaborators are started to rise. So it seems that at least from a bibliometric perspective, the field, or whatever we want to call this area of research, is somehow increasing in numbers of papers, works, and also collaborations. And in terms of journals, many journals has rise over the years. I think the journals are quite old, and I will tell you a little bit about Jacob Moreno in a couple of slides afterwards. But sociometry was already there in 1937. It was first called Sociometric Review, and then in 1978 they changed the name to Social Psychology, and then Social Psychology Quarterly. And then near the same time, Social Network Journals appears, and then there was a bunch of other a bunch of other journals that were also there. And for example, Network Science appears in 2013. So as you can see, there are some milestones here that that somehow are telling us about the aggressive, and I will put it this way, the aggressive, the intention of certain groups to put the name of this specialty somehow in an institutional form. What is interesting from this bibliometric study from Matseva and Bataguer is that Social Network maybe is one of the main journals that you can see is very embedded into sociology. So this is something that it has been like that since the 70s, and now it's becoming a bit more interdisciplinary. But we will talk about that in a couple of slides. Okay. In terms of the social network journals, we can see still some groups that are around. If you see, for example, this small graph, you can identify some of the statisticians. Let's say, for example, Gary Robbins is in here, Johan Koskinen, Christian Stiglitz, Christoph Stadtfeld is in here as well. You can see mathematicians around here. So, for example, David Schoch, Ulrich Brandes, Linton Freeman, among others. So if you see now, let's say, well, this is from 2015 and 2020, most of the people that were already in the 70s working on this area of research still are somehow around, let's say. And I think that's very impressive in terms of, if you compare with other specialties, for example, in sociology, most of the specialty has shorter period of time they tend to endure, let's say, 20-30 years. If you see ethnomethodology, for example, they completely disappear, or it's very unlikely to see papers nowadays about like big ethnomethodologies and so on and so forth. So it seems that at least in the case of network or this specialty is something that has been around from at least near 90 years, or a bit less, but somehow something around there. But still, I do believe that we have there is some bias in the community. I think it's still women are not well represented yet, and I hope that's something that initiatives such as WINS will help encouraging, to reverse the situations. and also institution or researchers that are in institutions from the global south are actually not well represented as well, at least in two journals that we were investigating with Francisca. Okay, now in terms of high self-citation, I think what's really interesting from this other bibliometric study is that social network is very endogamic, and this is something that that I just wanted to point it out. It's 34% of the citations are self-citations, which means that this speciality, in fact, might become something detached from disciplines, but also, I will not say much more about this. Just want to point that. And I think all of the characteristic of the institutionalization of network is since the very beginning, there was a bunch of softwares that has been around from many years. And I picked, for example, this paper from Huisman and Van Dijk from 2011. And here you can see that already in the 1988, there was some software that were the main software, and some of them remain on time. So for example, if you can see from here, UCINet has been around at least until 2008. We have now a collection of very new and more software, which means that somehow this specialty is becoming more and more institutionalized and more in the normal state of science, I would say. Now, a follow-up question is, okay, right, so let's say from now we were saying, okay, social network, there was a group of people that were trying to create or institutionalize this specialty. But the main question is, okay, but if its network is more general than simple social network, let's say, then is this really a subdimension of something else? And this discussion maybe start to be more important, let's say, somewhere around the 2000s. And this was mostly because of what some people from the social network perspective call it the invention of the physicist. And the reason is because physicists become very interested in social networks. So there were appearing new models, and I think it's somehow related with the internet, big data, new methods, and so then it was not only social scientists working, even though it had never been only social scientists working on this specialty, but increasingly a group of people from physics were very heavily working on this. And even in 2004, for example, Duncan Watts was already calling this like a new science of networks because of the interdisciplinary synthesis of new analytical techniques, computing power, and unprecedented volume of empirical data. So they were thinking, okay, it seems that we are doing something different. And of course, this was creating a lot of disagreement between groups. But and near the same time, let's say in 2005, in the US at least, network science was defined as a new field of basic research. So there was a sort of establishment that network science was somehow happening, and there was a lot of reaction on this. But okay, but what we can agree maybe is that the field has expanded and evolved significantly in the intersection between social science and other disciplines such as physics, data science, or study of social animals. So it's not longer a domain that it was mostly done or mostly defended, let's say, by sociologists or social scientists, but now it's becoming more and more interdisciplinarity. And I think this is very exciting in terms of, we don't know what's going to happen, or we will see what happens. And I hope that, because maybe some of you are newcomers to the field, this is your time to keep the eyes open to see what is the bright future of this area. Okay, so this is maybe the social dimension of what I was calling the paradigm. Now, in here, there's some reactions in the early times from this invasion of physicists, but I will skip this because of time. Okay, so I will say that there is a group of people calling it, okay, there are 20 years of network science, and I think this is something that can be discussed because these 20 years is mostly because of a paper which was called the Small World from Duncan and Strogatz in 1998. And in a way, the way I understand this conflict is mostly a group of people fighting in the field of science or making their domain more or less predominant, but this clearly pissed off many other researchers. So yeah, this is something that was happening in the 2000s with the invasion of physicists. But if we want to be fair with them, you can say, okay, there were some papers, let's say Watson, Strogatz, and the small world networks, Baravacci and Albert with what they call the preferential attachment, or Newman, that actually had so many citations that if you start thinking about, okay, you can claim, well, they were clearly making a breakthrough somehow in the history of science, but also you can be more suspicious and say, well, but if you compare the size of disciplines such as sociology with computer science or physics, then you might want to normalize that by the size of the disciplines. But this is something that if you want to make the argument, this might be something that could make the point. Okay, now let's go back to an earlier question. We were saying, okay, at least a group of people were already claiming in the 70s that there was a paradigm. Now, the main point why they were thinking, okay, let's put it this way. The main issue here of why they were thinking whether this was a paradigm or not, it was mostly because it was not clear whether there was a theory. And this is the elephant in the room, at least for social scientists, for decades. Many times in the history of networks, this question has arisen, and it's coming back for. And the question here is not obvious because there is no agreement of what a theory is. So you can say, well, there are some theories, but I think most of the sociologists, at least in the 70s, they were very used to big general theories. So they were somehow a bit concerned whether social network could become part of the discussions of different disciplines if they had some sort of agreements on fundamental ontological things. So this is something called the theory gaps in social networks, and I think this is kind of something that over and over is coming back and forth. My perspective, at least, I think that social networks, at least, have produced numbers of theories. There is not really an ontological perspective, maybe, but we do share a relational orientation toward the world. So we do care about connections, we do care about social ties, we do care about a type of representation that somehow resemble a system, whatever that system is. So this is basically something that again, I'll try to leave it open to you to decide what do you think about that. Okay, now let's talk about the cognitive part of network science. So we were talking mostly about the structural dimensions. We were talking about the invasion of the physicists. We were talking about software, organizations, Sunbelt, and so on and so forth. But of course, people have been thinking about, right, if we have to cognitively think about the paradigm, what are the agreements that we have? There are some claims, let's say. And this is a paper from Ulrich Brandt from 2013. And what is interesting from this paper is that a journal so this was the opening of a new journal, which was called the Network Science. So in a way, I think that it was a programmatic statement of saying what we want the network science to be. And in here, they make 7 different claims. And so, for example, network science, the study of network models. There are some theories about network representations and network theories about phenomenon. Both constitute network theory. Network science should be empirical, not exclusively, but consistently. And well, you can see here the seven claims. So my point in here is that if you think about a paradigm from a cognitive perspective, then you can clearly see that there was a way of trying to organize the jungle of different perspectives in a way, and this was one of the approaches. I have my complaints about these claims, but I think it's not safe to say my complaints, so I will just skip this part. But I think that are not fair for many reasons, so I will just skip it. So now, let's go to the most cited networks. The most cited works. And as you can see in here, another paper from Matseva and Bataguer, there are some papers that are becoming the classics in social network or network science. And one of them, for example, is the Handbook of Weizmann and Faust from 1984. Maybe some of you have heard about the strength of the weak ties. This is Granovetter here, Duncan Watt with the small world model, Barabatinaldo with the preferential attachment model, Linton Freeman. I think this is the centrality paper. McPherson here is from the concept of homophily, Ronald Burt with the structural holes, and so on and so forth. So as you can see, there is some sort of a classic that I believe that most of the social network researchers tend to agree on. And if that's the case, I think that somehow there is a scientific speciality that exists for many years, and that somehow we do agree on certain epistemological perspective. We do have some practices. We do agree on certain methods. So at least from this scientific speciality level, we agree. Now the discipline is a bit different, but again, I'll try to leave it open. And in terms of the topics of the thing, or let's say the words that people tend to use more often, well, this is another study from the same author that I presented before, but you can see that the concept of social network, structure, relationships, ties, role, graph are part of the jargon of this community. And of course, you can see all the things like network insight, which is somehow a conflation between new technology, new software, new medias with an area of research. So I think this is becoming, this really makes the social network perspective less clear in terms of the area of the research that they are claiming, when these other concepts are also used elsewhere. Okay, right. So this was only the introduction to tell you that there is a institutionalization of social network. I think I'm okay with the time, so that's good. I thought that it would take longer. But I would like to hear you, maybe if some of you have questions or want to, say something. Okay, I think that I'm extremely clear then.
Yeah, I don't see any questions in the chat, so.
Or maybe you're really good actors and you're all pretending that you are following and you have no questions. Thank you, either way. Okay, so let's go from the history of networks. And again, this will be highly based on Linton Freeman perspective. So this is the way I think the first group in the 70s has developed their own story, the own way of thinking about networks. Okay, let's start from the beginning. George Simmel. So maybe some of you are familiar with sociology or not, but if you are familiar with sociology, you may immediately recognize that George Simmel is one of the father of the discipline. And at least for many social network researchers, George Simmel, and maybe at some extent Emil Durkheim, has been thought as the one of the most important forerunners of the social network approach. And what is interesting is when Simmel was defining what society is, he was saying, okay, society exists where a number of individuals enter into interactions. So he was already trying to isolate the concept or the object of sociology through the concept of interaction. And interaction was then the starting point in which the society emerged. And according to Simmel, the problem and the object of sociology is the identification of the form of association, which is basically what we maybe now modernly we call conceptualization of something. So association was the form, the basel, or something that we can somehow create a morphological structure in which we can learn from. Back in his work, this form of association were marriage, traveling acquaintanceships, secret society, competitions. So it's basically a way of isolating sociological phenomenon. Okay. Now, what is interesting from this gesture, let's say, and that's why I'm talking still about George Simmel, is that George Simmel, at least at the beginning, he was separating between the form, let's say the vessel of the associations, and the content, which is the meanings or related to individual actions, the motivation that explain why individuals enter into interactions. So if you are in the field of social science, you can immediately see that there is a qualitative and quantitative approach here. Somehow you can isolate concept, but on the other hand, you can also learn what is inside this concept, or what are these concepts? What is the meaning of this concept? And I think this is something that still social network researchers tend to do quite often. Now, a very common concept from Simmel is the social circles. And why he was thinking about social circles? Because he was thinking on the evolution of modernity. So he was thinking on why modern era is the way it is. And he was differentiating between the tribus society with modern society. And he believed that when individuals become free of the choices that they can do, they might end up sharing activities with others, and these activities might start becoming their own sphere of actions. And these spheres of actions will become a new way of social differentiation, let's say. Yeah? So why I'm saying this is mostly because, again, the concept of social circle has been used extensively in social network. For example, if you see the works of Peter Blau, he used the concept of social circle very explicitly. If you see the works of Ronald Breiger, he used the concept of social circle very explicitly. If you see the work of Charles Kadushin, he worked on the concept of social circles very explicitly. But what is interesting is that it's rooted in sociological theory, but is formalized in network representations. So somehow it is a very nice gesture between sociological concepts that then become measurable or somehow treated in a very empirical or a very formal way. And here's a very long citation from Simmel. I will not go through it, but I would just want to point out, for example, this last sentences of the paragraph. If you are familiar, for example, with the work of Scott Fell, you might see that it's very similar the way George Simmel was defining social circles of what Scott Fell did afterwards. So I just want to point out that George Simmel somehow has been someone who has inspired many of the concepts or many ideas of network researchers. And if you want to move even further, you can see that there are other quantities, for example, dyad, triad, small group, large group, number of as principle of organizing groups that comes from the theory of CML. And these are concepts that, again, were highly used at the beginning of the discipline, but also we use it nowadays as part of our jargon, let's say. So we do talk about diet, we do talk about triad, but they have a very old story that somehow is rooted by this concept. And well, and according to Bettina Holstein, which gave us the keynote speech this year in Slovenia, in Oysen, I think she was referring to this chapter in a compilation by Marius Moll and others. But let's say many of the early network researchers was already inspired by CML. So, for example, social exchange theory by Homans or Peter Blau, conflict theory, small group research. And according to Freeman, this gives us a structural thinking and influenced the first Harvard Trust, or Kurt Lewin and Jacob Moreno and others. And as I mentioned before, there's a number of people that were actually very close to the theories of George CML. So, for example, Robert Merton, he translates some of the papers of George CML, and, for example, he gave it to some of his students, Charles Kadushin, for instance. I think Peter Blau was also there, James Coleman, and they were all reading very closely, line by line, this type of theories. So if you're interested in social science, and if you're interested in see the connection with the establishment of sociology, then this might be a way of doing it. And I think this has been also part of the way the social network speciality has tried to create a framework, a common framework. It's not an accident, I would say, that the maximum prize in INSNA is called the CML Award. That's for a reason. Okay. So this is George CML. Okay. Let me know if I'm going too fast, because I have like 69 slides. So I will have to just run through many of the slides. But if you're interested in something catch your attention, then we can spend more time talking about some details or whatever you think might be interesting. Okay. So this diagram comes from Scott Fell. And Scott Fell, at least, and again, a bit based on Milton Friedman as well, he thought that there were some groups, and I will call it groups now, that somehow were building the social network perspective. And I will divide the rest of this presentation in the same logic. So one group was from the social psychologists. They are in here. Then we have people from the Department of Business. We have people from anthropology, and then sociologists are somehow here. And we should add an arrow. And I think in a later revision from Scott Fell, no, sorry, this is not Scott Fell, this is John Scott. He had also an arrow from the physicist somewhere here. But this is somehow the different centers that, according to Linton Freeman and others, were kind of institutionalized in the perspective of social network in a common framework. And yeah, I just want to mention that in between the 40s and 69, there were already some research centers working on some social network intuitions. And the Michigan State, the Sorbonne, Lund, Chicago, Columbia, among others. Okay. Now, Jacob Moreno and Helen Jennings. We are starting from the very beginning. In the early 30s, Jacob Moreno and Helen Jennings were building the first long-range sociometric study. And it was done in the New York State Training School of Girls in Hudson, New York. And this gives some material for the book Who Shall Survive, which most of the social network researchers will call one of the first, or maybe the first, systematic social network study, mostly because they include systematic empirical data, and they use something that they call it the sociometric techniques. Yeah, and I think one of the things that I have read so far is that Helen Jennings perhaps is one of the person who give the most. She contributes mostly on the method, on the formal dimension, and it's very hard to disentangle them on the work that they were pursuing together. I was trying to find a picture of Helen Jennings, I couldn't find it, but I think, to me at least, it would be fair to treat them both as the initiation of sociometry. I don't think it's only Jacob Moreno. Okay. Now, back then in the 30s, they were using some concepts. So, for example, they were using the concept of sociometry, which for them was the mathematical study of psychological properties of populations. For them, it was the inquiry into the evolution of organization of groups and the position of individuals within them. So sociometry was the perspective of using quantitative tools to analyze groups and positions of individuals, which is, again, if you think about what is a network, somehow networks are highly related with positions of people, with groups, with individuals taking action and deciding to whom to create ties. And already in the 30s, this was the way they thought about it. Now, what is interesting as well is that, at least for Jacob Moreno and Helen Jennings, sociometry was considered as kind of physics, with its own social atoms and social gravitation's law. And this is very explicit in the way they write it in the book. And I think that if you are aware of sociology, and sorry for my sociological bias, but if you're aware of Auguste Comte, Comte was calling sociology social physics, really. So that was the purpose of Comte. And in a way, this is somehow related, at least to try to find some regularities, to try to find atoms, or to make the disciplines look more scientific, maybe. And yeah, and what else? Oh yeah, and in this period, again, appears the concept of sociogram, which was this visualization that you can see at the right side of the screen, and sociomatrix, which was the matrix representation. So already in the 30s, Jacob Moreno and Helen Jennings were working with graph or visual representations, matrices, and they had this intuition of finding regularity, and so on and so forth. Of course, they were not the first. I have to say, it doesn't mean that people were not doing this type of representation before. It's just that again, and I want to try to be very explicit in here, that at least for a group of people that were trying to institutionalize this area of specialization, Jacob Moreno and Helen Jennings were the ones that somehow represent the best of the spirit of this group. But if you want to, dig deeper and deeper, you can see many network representation in very different disciplines, places, matrix representations. So just to make it clear that this is not necessarily the first network representation, but is somehow, from the perspective of this group, is one of the first studies that represent best the spirit of what they think social networks should be. Okay. What is also interesting from this period is that Jacob Moreno and Helen Jennings were already using certain concepts that we use, or somehow has been modified on time, but some of them are still around. So, for example, they use the concept of sociometric stars, mutuality, chains. They call something called the gaps or cleavage area. That typo there, wow, which is a sort of cluster. And maybe what is very interesting as well is that Moreno and Jennings, in collaboration with with a mathematical sociologist, Paul Lassafer, they were working also in a type of statistical model that somehow is very old. It comes from 1938. And back then, they call a regularity the social dynamic effect, which I quote, is the distortion of choice distribution in favor of the more chosen as against the less chosen. Okay, which in principle, if you're aware of this area of research, might be a similar idea of what was later called the accumulative advantages, preferential attachment, or Matthew effect. So somehow this idea were already there in 1938. Okay. Let's, Francisca, what do you think? Should we move forward or maybe have a small break of 5 minutes?
We can do 5 minutes now. It's okay.
Okay, yeah. Let's do 5 minutes and I will continue the rest of the slides.
Okay, see you everyone in 5 minutes.
So, okay, I hope I'm not going too fast. I think I want to give you a whole picture of what I think is the institutionalized history of networks, but I know that I'm missing too many details in between. So so I hope I'm not going that fast. But okay, so we were saying that Jacob Moreno and Helen Jennings were working somehow around the 30s, and at least from Linton Freeman perspective, there was something called the first Harvard School of Networks. And this period was, I think it was in the 40s, 50s. And this was a group of people working mostly on the Graduate School of Business Administration. And this was near, well, this was in Massachusetts, in the US. And in here, the key actors were William Lloyd Wagner, George Elton Mayo, Fritz Ritzelberger, Nord Whitehead, and Henderson. And what is interesting is that there was a group of researchers working on networks, which has, again, a group of students that were very predominant in the history of networks. So, for example, Elliot Chappell was important, Arensberg, Alison Davis, Elizabeth Davis, Burleigh Gardner, Caspar Homans, and William Foote White. And one of the interesting, or how people tell the story of the first Harvard School is through the interaction between Radcliffe Brown and William Lloyd Wagner. So what is interesting here is that maybe you don't know about this, but or maybe you do, but Wagner was actually an actor from Broadway. So he was trying to be famous in Broadway. I think he was not very successful in achieving that. But then he went back to academia and he met Radcliffe Brown. And Radcliffe Brown, I don't know if there are anthropologists in here, but Radcliffe Brown is one of the father of anthropology. So we're talking now of this is the very beginning of the consolidation of sociology and anthropology at the same time. But Radcliffe Brown, this is how the story was told. He was joking around the table, and he mentioned to Wagner, "Did you want to go to Australia and do an ethnography?" And he was like, "Yeah, okay, yeah, why not?" So Wagner ended up in Australia doing ethnography, and when he went back to Harvard, he started training researchers into this new technique, which was like, okay, I will conduct ethnography, and he wanted to conduct ethnography in industrial communities. So this is somehow how Wagner and Radcliffe Brown met. But also, I think Werner also met Branislav Malinowski, which is another of the father of anthropology. So at least this school was highly embedded into the anthropological scene. Okay, what is really interesting from this period is that most of the researchers working on the graduate school of business, they were doing a seminar together. They were working on big projects in which the students were also involved. So, for example, you might recognize in here this table, the Southern Woman, which is highly used for two-mode networks. And this was a study called The Deep South, which was done by Alison and Elizabeth Davis. They were a couple, and the Gardners was another couple. So this was in the period of segregation in the US, and they were trying to identify in different villages how people were creating social relationship. Another study which is very famous is the management and the workers, called the Hawthorne Study or Western Electronic Project. And if you are in the field of organizational studies, maybe you have heard about the light. People, the managers turning on the light, and because they were turning on the light, that increased the productivity of the workers, because the workers, in the interpretation that they made was, oh, the managers cares about us, so they become more productive. Well, in the same study, they were doing also networks. So it was not only about the light, which is what organizational studies will tell you, but they were also working on something that they call it cliques. So cliques, again, is something that we use quite intensively in social networks. And most of the ideas come from this study as well. And if I think there is something interesting from here, is that back then they were analyzing different networks. They aggregate all the networks, and then only the aggregation of multiple networks create the clique, which is an idea that I think has been forgotten on time. Now, another study is the Yankee City, which is from Joy Warner, in which back then he was also investigating the interaction between the people of this village. And one of the ideas that came from there is the overlapping cliques. So overlapping cliques was already, and this was not formalized by then, it was theorized, but they were already kind of thinking on this type of structure. And another very famous study is from the Street Corner Society, which I think it was a bestseller back in I don't remember the time, but let's say somewhere around the 80s, maybe 70s. I will have to double check this one. But the Street Corner Society, they were also called Cornerville study. The Cornerville study was investigating criminal gangs. So they were following the Northerns, and I don't remember the name of the other group. But what they were doing was following, okay, Doc was the head of the organization, and he had in charge different people, and then they had their boys, or the corner boys, that were dealing with the drugs and things alike. So as you can see, very early on, there was collective projects done by many researchers, by many students, and they were working on industry studies, ethnographical studies, and early criminology studies. So at the really very beginning, we already had a bunch of different studies from very different disciplines. Okay, second group. So we are, just a quick reminder, we are here. So we were talking about Werner and Mayo. Now we will move to the small group. So, according to the Mullins, Nicholas Mullins and Caroline Mullins, the small group theory, it was a light that failed. So according to them, the group theory had all the elements to become a proper speciality, but it was fading to oblivion. So they stopped their research agenda, and it become very hard to do or conduct research following this way of thinking. But anyway, this is still, I think, very important for social network researchers, and for many reasons. But before I start talking about this group, what people agree is that there was someone called Kurt Lewin, which is this guy here, that was the mentor or the leader of this group. But the sad thing is that Kurt Lewin passed away when he was only 53. The group, or the reason why the Malins believed that this was a paradigm or a speciality that failed is because he was so prominent in developing this area of research that no one were really able to cope or keep this line of thought on time. Okay, but we are now talking about social psychologists. So we were talking before about people in graduate research. Jacob Moreno and Helen Jering were also psychologists. This guy is also social psychologist. And in here, you can identify maybe some of very predominant researchers. So for example, we are aware that Lewin was very close to Heide, and Heide was someone who was working on structural balance. So the first idea of the structural balance came from Heide, and they were in dialogue. So Lewin and Heide were already working on these principles. And that's why, as you might identify here, many of the people that were also working on structural balance were also discussing with Heide. So for example, we have Newcomb and Fitzinger, who was working or generalizing this idea of cognitive dissonance, which was associated with the structural balance. They were talking about the proximity effect, whether if you are close or not will actually have an effect on the interactions. Then we have people such as Cartwright or Harari, which were also working on this idea of a structural balance, but now using formal network representations. And there is some influence models coming from here. For example, French is someone who was also working on influence models. So as you can see, Cartwright, Harari, French, and others were part of this period. And if you're more interested in the theory part, in the theoretical part, Homans was part of this group, and he was part of the Harvard School, and also was trying to work on the group dynamics. So you can see the overlap between different members, and he was developing something that he called the network exchange theory, based on the studies of the first Harvard School. So as you can see, there were already some proto ideas that were developed in this period. And another maybe something to point out is the study of Babelas, which inspired somehow the centrality measures. So during this period, he was conducting an experiment, and in this experiment, he was trying to see, to identify how optimum was the communication within this group. And he was playing around with different structures, and Linton Freeman's belief that this was kind of the way in which centrality measures started. So most of these concepts, as you might see or you might identify, I'm assuming that some of you or most of you are somehow aware or have some introduction about social networks. You can identify some concepts. You can see that in here, we are still talking about science network. We still talk about cliques. We still talk about influence models, centrality. We talk about most of the things. So it was originated somewhere around or somehow around the small group dynamic group. Okay. Near the same period, this is a couple of years afterwards, there was a mathematician called Manfred Kochen and a political scientist called Ithiel de Solapol that were working on a mathematical model to estimate or to tackle what is called the small world problem. And the small world problem was stated of, okay, if two persons are selected at random from a population, what are the chances that they will know each other? And more generally, how long a change of acquaintanceships will be required to link them? Whoops, I did something on my screen. Okay. Okay, anyway. And this was a paper that was circulated somewhere around the 50s. And I remember reading from Stanley Milgram and Mark Granovetter, and they all make reference to this paper. So it was already, if you go to the source of this of the small world problem, this paper is mentioned in different places. So the small world problem, the mathematical formulation was already very old, and the empirical study that we're working on this issue was near 20 years afterwards, which was from Stanley Milgram. And I think you might know this study very well, but in case you don't know it, it was an experiment in which people were sending letters from one area of the United States to the other area, and they were calculating how many steps were needed to reach the other side, to reach the other side. And I think the average was, if I'm not mistaken, was 5.5. So that's why now we call it the 6 degrees of separation. And of course, now the most famous paper is probably Duncan and Watts from 1998, but this ideas was already there early on. And this is the paper actually, that it was a manuscript before, and only in 1978 it was published as a part of the paper of the Social Network Journal. Okay. Now, graph. The idea of graphs are very old, and you can claim that the idea of graph comes from the 18th century. So you can say Leonhard Euler was already tackling mathematical issues using graph. And actually, people such as Kirchhoff and Cayley were already developing theorems about graph theory and applying them to things like electronic circuit, chemical isomers, and so on. But one of the figures that has been extremely important in the graph theory literature is Frank Harari. And Frank Harari developed the formal language of graph theory in the 50s, 60s, somewhere around there. And what's really interesting from there is that he took the decision to apply or to work on social science problems using graph theory. So he was publishing with Norman in 1953 a book called The Graph Theory as a Mathematical Model in Social Science. So as you can see, maybe by accident, one of the modern father of graph theory was already working on social network as well. And we were already talking about the small group, and immediately Cartwright and some of the colleagues, such as Kurt Lewin and others, Clark Hall through Babelas, they were already using this language in their own research. So you can see the connection between Harari and the formal work of the mathematicians working on graph theory into the social psychology literature. But you can claim, okay, yeah, but this idea are quite old. Genealogical diagrams were there for many years. And this is actually a paper from John Barnes with Frank Harari, in which they were explaining this connection. Okay, now there is some criticism in here because for mathematicians, they believe that it's not fair for network researchers because they are not contributed to mathematics that much. So back in this paper from Barnes and Harari, they were claiming, well, the relation between graph theoretical concepts are seldom seen in network analysis. They are not considering because they are not really treating theorem as something that should contribute to mathematics. So you can make the point, okay, social network researchers, you should be more you should contribute to other disciplines as well. Okay, now back to another school. So I will just quickly go here. So we were reviewing the Gestalt theory, are Jacob Moreno, Helen Jennings. Graph theory was Harari. We had in here the first school of networks from Harvard. Kaspar Homans is someone who I mentioned very, very briefly. And now we are going to talk about the anthropologists in here. So we will talk about Mark Lackman, Barnes, Bott, and Nadel, and Clyde Mitchell. So let's go back here. So, okay. So back in the 50s, there was a group of researchers from the Manchester School of Networks. And at the beginning, at least, Max Glackman was already working with Radcliffe Brown. And I already talked about Radcliffe Brown very briefly. Radcliffe Brown was one of the father of anthropologists, as well as Malinowski. And Max Glackman was actually student of Evan Pritchard, also a very famous British anthropologist, and Radcliffe Brown. And what is very interesting from this school is that they were investigating different societies. So, for example, Barnes and Bott were working on Western European communities. John Barnes was working in Norway, and Elizabeth Bott was working in London, and Adrian Meyer was working in India. Philip Meyer, Ruth Kapferer, Arnold Leonard Epstein were working in African towns. So you can see that they were doing ethnographical research in different places. Well, some nice picture in here. You can see Max Glackman with John Barnes walking together. And this is Elizabeth Bott, also known as Elizabeth Spilius, which is one of the most famous book about studies related with family. So if you're interested in family studies, Elizabeth Bott has the Bott hypothesis, which is extremely important in that area of research. So again, we are opening to other area of research again. Okay, now, the Manchester School of Networks has been very influential. It was associated with the Department of Social Anthropology at Manchester University, and the central figure was clearly Max Glackman. And Max Glackman was running a regular seminar, which is now called the Mitchell Center Seminar. It's also kind of an heritage of that. And most of the participants of this group were part of what was called the Rhodes Livingstone Institute in Central Africa. So they had remember we are in the middle of the British colonialism, so they had an institution in Africa, and they were sending anthropologists there. So that was the context. And from a theoretical perspective, they were opposing the dominant Parsonian theories, which is in the 50s was very important for sociologists. Parson became like the main figure, but everyone was criticizing him from the social network perspective. And what I think is important from this group is that at least Siegfried Nadel was creating a programmatic statement that was somehow very theoretical. And he was using structural thinking through networks. And he has a very famous book from 1957. But it was Clyde Mitchell who created a systematic framework for social network analysis, considering the graph theory and sociometry using the framework of sociology. So somehow he was connecting not only the theory, but also the tool. And that's why it's not strange to see Frank Harari working with John Barnes, because they were both collaborating at a certain point, and most of them were reading actually the books that Harari was developing. I'm not mentioning here, but I remember talking with Patrick Dorian and Martin Everett, and they both remember the book from Frank Harari that was created in 1967 in collaboration with Cartwright and Norman, which is, I think I show it here. Yeah, it's here, this one, which was maybe the book available about graph theory in the early 70s. So, this is kind of the way things started, at least from a mathematical perspective. Okay. I will skip this, but this school claim that the concept of social network started here. So before they were calling it sociometry or interactions or relationships, but John Barnes in 1954 used explicitly the concept of social networks as a way of connecting theory with relationship, with somehow a more systematic way of understanding social ties. So yeah, according to this school, they were the first. You can double check if this is true. Now, the other thing that I would like to mention here from this school is that they were also using many concepts that we use nowadays in social networks. And this comes from a book called The Social Networks in Urban Situations. And this book was kind of the first handbook maybe about social networks, because in this concept, at least Clyde Mitchell was trying to give a list of potential measurements and the conceptualization of this measurement. And back then he called it anchorage, density, reachability, range. And maybe you might identify things like density, which was called before loose or close-knit by Elizabeth Bott. So there was a discussion between Elizabeth Bott and John Barnes about the usage of the right word to use, or which was the right concept to use, and they decided to call it density back then. But before that was called loose or close-knit, which is the concept that Elizabeth Bott used. Reachability is also used already in Frank Harari, but it was used also in this school as part of the conceptual tools. And Glackman, again, the head of this group, was the first to use the concept of multiplexity. And this was a book from 1955. And why he was thinking about multiplexity? Because he thought that if you really want to represent modern societies, you have to start thinking about multiple relationships instead of uniplex relationships, which were mostly dominated by religious and political reasons. And so that was the way he thought about multiplexity back then. Clyde Mitchell and this group also were thinking on the content of the interaction. And I'm making this point because, so I'm making this point because, as you can see now, the concept of contents become important. And if you remember, George Simmel was making the distinction between associations as a form and a content. Then we can say, okay, it seems to be some parallels here, because this might be the forms, and the content then is the meaning that person gives to the attribute of the relationship. So because they were anthropologists, they were thinking, okay, what is the meaning of the thing of the relationship that people had? And of course, we now use things like directions, durability of ties, intensity, frequency of interaction, which are now part of our jargon in modern social network research. Okay, now continuing with anthropologists, but now instead of talking about the anthropologists from the UK, we're going to talk about the anthropologists from France. Now in here we have Lévi-Strauss, and Lévi-Strauss is one of the most important structuralists in sociology, and Lévi-Strauss was already working with a type of representation which was trying to understand system of kinships and marriage. And Lévi-Strauss was very specific in using this type of representation. So as you can see in here, they look like networks. This imaginary was already there. But I will say, and this is not something that comes from me necessarily, but that André Weil used or took some of the ideas of Lévi-Strauss and create the first algebraic models to understand kinship. So André Weil has a chapter in one of the most important work from Lévi-Strauss in which he developed the algebraic models that Lévi-Strauss was theorizing, but he was trying to represent more formally. And why I'm mentioning this is because this was this was used as an inspiration of one of the most prominent leaders of next schools of thought, which was Harrison White. So Harrison White built from Andre Bale, who was also building from Lévi-Strauss, to create some networks concept afterwards. So, okay. Now, in terms of, I want just to mention some things about some mathematicians. They are not really only in the field of sociology, but also in the field of biology, and yeah, they were mostly in biology. But the head of this group was someone called Rashevsky, and Rashevsky was the chair of a committee of the mathematical biology at Chicago, and he was the professor of prominent researchers such as Herbert Landau, and I want just to mention Anatol Rapoport, Salmonov. If you are aware of neural networks, a neural network came from the same group. So the concept of neural network came from this team. But if you are interested in the statistical models of networks, you might see that some of the first distribution using graph came from Salmonov and Rapoport, even before the Erdos ranging model. So this is 1951. Yeah. So, and actually, if you see the paper from Mark Granovetter, you will see that Rapoport is very predominant in his narrative, in the way he explained some of his motivation about social networks. So again, there were mathematicians working on different things. They were using the idea of networks without necessarily engaging yet with other network researchers. But this was clearly a very important contribution to the field. And you can see here a seminar of Rashevsky, which is very cozy though, right? And like very close. Anyway. Okay, going back to, where are we? Yeah. Okay, now the Columbia University. Again, the Columbia University, there were two very important sociologists. One was Paul Lassafert and the other is Robert Merton. And what is really interesting from these two researchers is that Merton was a sociological theorist. So he's very well known because of the big theory that he has. But Paul Lassafert is probably the most important mathematical sociologist as well. He actually works with Moreno and Jennings. So you can see the connections between sociometry and mathematical sociology from the very beginning. And Paul Lassafert actually used the concept of operationalization. So he was the one who created the concept. But what is also interesting is that Paul Lassafert and Merton uses the concept of homophily. For example, they created in 1954, they use explicitly the concept of homophily, and nowadays we use it as part of our tool for our own research. Now, maybe what is more important from this group is that they were training many other different students. So if you are interested in sociology of science and knowledge, you might be aware of the studies of diffusion of innovation. That's come from Menzel and Katz, but also from Coleman, and other very predominant researchers are Peter Blau. He was extending the concept of homophily, and now we call it the Blau space, which is basically homophily at the level of the population or something. Well, I will not go into details, but let's keep it that he was extending the concept of homophily. There were also I think the supervisor of Kadushin, who was extending the concept of social circles. And then James Coleman, for example, was the professor of people such as Ronald Burt and Scott Fell, which are there because they are kind of very predominant. And the work of sociometry and Lassafert also inspired the work of Everett Rogers, who maybe is one of the most important researchers working on, at the beginning, or at least in the concept of diffusion of innovation. So the concept of diffusion of innovations came mostly from this school of thought. And I just wanted to point out that Ronald Burt is probably one of the most cited network researchers because he used the concept of structural holes. And Scott Fell is also a very important researcher that uses the concept of focus of activities. So this is kind of trying to demonstrate how this line of thought have been developed even in current and modern social network research. Okay, now we have the statisticians, and the statisticians, the group of statisticians was mostly working in the 70s. It doesn't mean that they were not doing things before, but the group of people that were extensively or more working more thoroughly on the statistical problems on the lens of social network was probably Paul Hollands and Samuel Leinhardt. There were the people that were around that period was Peter Blau and James Davis, and maybe some of you might be aware of the MAN label or the triad census that comes from a work in collaboration with Davis and his student Samuel Leinhardt. And then Samuel Leinhardt was then a collaborator of people such as Paul Holland and Stanley Weisserman. And again, Weisserman was very important because he created this handbook, which was one of the most important handbook from the 90s of social networks. And yeah, but what I'm trying to say here is that this was the group that was mostly working on models such as the P1 model. They were working on stochastic block models. They were then this model then extended to the P star models, or now call it the exponential random graph models, and now maybe that inspires things afterwards. Yeah. Okay. Right. Now I'm near finishing, so I know that you might be very tired. So I'm heading to the end. And I'm sorry that I was too fast because I just wanted to show you as much as I can. But there is another school of thought which comes from the second Harvard School of Network. And I'll have to go back to here, somewhere here. Yeah, we are here. So to recap, we were talking about the small group dynamics, digital theory, graph theory. Then we jumped to the first school of networks from Harvard. Then we talk about the anthropologists. And we are here now. We're going to talk about Harrison White, which is what we call the second school of Harvard. Okay, so we are here. So Harrison White he had 2 PhD. He was not happy on only having one, so he wants to have 2, because why not? His first PhD was in theoretical physics from the MIT. And his second, and he was saying, well, I want to do something more complicated. That's what he said. And I want to understand society, which is extremely complicated. So I will do a PhD in sociology. And yeah, what I think is very interesting from here is that he was clearly very aware of the things that were happening in physics, and he was using his knowledge to apply it to sociology. So I think he was very unique in doing this in the 70s or 60s, well, not 60s really. And he had a very influential role in the Harvard Revolution in social networks. And the 2 things that he's more known for is about structural equivalence and the block models analysis. So remember that we were talking that he was inspired by the work of Levi-Strauss and Andrew Bale. So he was using the ideas from anthropology to understand kinship and marriage through the position of people. And this idea then became the block models analysis, because they were trying to go beyond relationship, but to try to synthesize or understand the blocks that are somehow a different type of representations. So just bear in mind where these things come from. And all the topics that they were investigating were, well, a lot of mathematical things, such as semi-group algebra, homomorphic reductions, image tables, among others. And people nowadays are saying that Harrison White has become a very influential role in what is an ongoing revolution in the New York School of Relational Sociology. And I will talk about that in a couple of slides. But people know about Harrison White mostly because of his students. And you can recognize many people in here. So for example, you can recognize maybe Philip Bonacic, a mathematical sociologist, Davis James. We were talking about Davis and his influence on Samuel Lanehart and Paul Holland. We have Katz. He was working on diffusion of innovation. You can see here Samuel Lanehart, again with Paul Holland and Davis. Barry Wellmans, he created the INSNA, so he created the Institution of Network Researchers. You can see Mark Granovetter. Here you can see Ronald Breiger, Paul DiMaggio, Peter Berman. So these are extremely important researchers in the social science mostly. So I will just talk about, I just want to mention some of them. So for example, Peter Berman created the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent to Adult Health. And he is one of the most important researchers in the analytical sociology. You have Ronald Breiger, who's very well known because of the projection of two-mode networks. And Mark Granovetter, of course, because of the very famous paper of the strength of weak ties, which is the most cited paper from social science. And you can see this is a screenshot from yesterday, I think. And actually, not only the strength of weak ties is very popular, but also his work on economical sociology and a revision of, but these are extremely popular papers in the social science. Okay, I'm near finishing, and I know you just bear with me a couple of slides and you're free to go. But there is something called the network revolution from New York. And do you remember that I was telling that there is the elephant of the room of, there is really a theory gap in networks. So there is a group of people that are trying to fill the gap. There's a group of people that are trying to build knowledge or to theorize about networks. And this is probably what they call the relational sociologists. And there's a very famous people from here, such as Peter Hedstrom, James Coleman, Nick Crossley, Mustafa Minbaya, Tilly Leiselsdorf. This is Harrison White. Because at certain point, 1982, I think it's the next slide, or not? Oh, no. Sorry. No, it's this slide. So, okay. So Harrison White was worried about the lack of theory about type of ties. So he decided to create a big theory, a general theory. And in 1992, he wrote this book about identity and control, which is extremely difficult to read. And a group of people were discussing about this new book. And in 1987, Mustafa Minbaya wrote a very influential paper called The Manifesto for Relational Sociology, which was kind of trying to make the point that we should think more thoroughly about the concept of relations and how the concept of relation is somehow related with these other structures that we were talking before. And again, if you think about CML, this is the form content discussion that we saw beforehand. And another school of thought is analytical sociology, but the main difference between the relational sociologists and the analytical sociologists is that they don't believe really in big theories, but they are mostly close to middle range theory. So according to them, social scientists should move to describe and classify social processes. And this is the aim that they are looking for. So they were saying, okay, there are so much misunderstanding between theories that we should at least agree on social mechanisms that operates in different areas. And so we will care mostly about these mechanisms. And some of the contemporary social scientists working on this area are people such as John Elster, Raymond Boudon, Tom Schelling, James Coleman, among others. And if you're aware, for example, about the Coleman boat, this is kind of the principle that is underlying the analytical sociologists. But they create their own institution, and here you have the SAT, James Coleman, and here is Robert Merton with the middle range theory. So, okay, I would recommend you to go to the Knitting Network podcast if you want to see it. Mark Granovetter, this is the passport of the study of the small world group he showed me. A happy Patrick Dorian and a Ross Bernard who talk about networks. So I'm just promoting a bit the okay, that's all what I have. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. If you want, you can clap in the online version, or I see some people clapping in the in-person version. So I don't know if anyone wants to comment anything or have any questions or some. You can also make questions about recommendations that maybe Alejandro can give you. I don't know. The floor is to anyone who would like to unmute themselves and just ask a question.
Hello, can you hear me?
No. Yes.
Okay, nice. Yeah, maybe a not really helpful question, but I would be interested in from your perspective, especially related to the history of social networks. Do you see some potential for new evolving schools in the context of social network science?
I mean, from a sociological perspective, that is something that should happen, let's say. So it's very likely that new groups will arise, that new ideas should come. And actually, if we are more serious about the sociological theory about science and knowledge, at certain point, they should challenge social networks. And then the question is whether they could survive to a massive criticism, a revolution from Kuhn perspective, or whether the program will be sufficiently strong to survive another 100 years. The only way that I see that they could potentially survive is whether they become a discipline or something that is beyond a specialty, which I'm not sure about it. So I think disciplines are the ones who remain on time. This is a big difference, but specialty not necessarily. And I think in the current state of the network perspective, I see it more as a specialty than a discipline. And so eventually, it could happen that other groups might challenge the establishment and they might fall.
Thank you.
Actually, I have a question. So I was wondering about the interdisciplinary aspect that we can see through history. Maybe you can refer a little bit about that, and if you think that maybe that's something that we still can see today, like in the community, there is a lot of different disciplines going around.
I mean, I think it's very obvious that there was an interdisciplinarity element in the way the history of network in the history of network. But I will say that interdisciplinary is a tricky concept because according to whom? If you go to physics, or STEM, or computer science, the question that computer scientists or physicists have might require certain things from social networks, but they will they will use interdisciplinarity to find the question that they are doing, the question that they have. And the same is true for social scientists. So social scientists have questions, and they are using interdisciplinarity to answer their questions. So I do think that there is a huge difference, and that's why it's not surprising that you can see network science as a different branch or something else, and social network as something that is heading more into social science, because I think they are using instrumentally interdisciplinarity differently. I hope that's yeah.
Thanks. Are there any other questions?
I do have a question, if it's okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alejandro, for this presentation. It was really impressive and complete. And I would want to add a more recent perspective on the connection between social media, online social media, and social network analysis. Do you have any ideas or content references that could help us understand the connections between the two and how maybe the pre-existence of social network analysis contributed to how social media were born and how today the reverse side is happening, that social media platforms and their analysis, especially by social scientists, are making new ways into social network analysis?
I think that's a tricky question, because I don't know when exactly the concept of social network was somehow mixed with what we call the new social media. So new media is the platform, let's say the internet or the World Wide Web, but not necessarily, which indeed they use connections as a principle, but they are mixed up. So I will say that, okay, internet is the hardware part, right? It's the interconnection between computers. And the World Wide Web is the language in which these computers are interconnected through the HTTP, I think. Yeah. And but yeah, from the 2000 at least, people such as Barabacci and Albert, they were using data from digital information to make analysis through the lens of social networks. But there are clearly different things, I would say, because social media is the study of the phenomenon happening in this environment, but social network is the epistemological or ontological phenomenon underpinning society. So somehow social media is an area of research about a sub-society, let's say. But I'm not sure. I will have to think about how to make a better connection. I don't know if that responds your question, Jasmine.
It does. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you, Jasmine, for that. I think we can finalize this first workshop. And if you have any other questions, you can always email Alejandro, or you can always attend to the next workshops that we're going to be happening in the same Zoom link. So from now in 2 weeks, we're going to be having a special workshop about how to deal with the PhD, which is something interesting because we are going to be talking with many different people in different stages. And actually we have people invited who is going to be talking about what they look in a PhD to be in general, in the first year, in the second year, third year, fourth year, I don't know. And then 2 weeks from that day, we're going to be having a third workshop about how you can work with our packages, which is going to be, I'm looking forward to that one too. And that one is going to be done by David Church. So hopefully we are going to be able to see each other in the next workshops. And thank you very much, Alejandro. I think we can do another round of applause. And thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you, Francisca, Soren, and the rest of the team for organizing, and for you all guys to attend.